The year was 1933. A young American woman stood in the Turkish countryside, shotgun in hand, participating in what should have been a routine hunting expedition with friends. Virginia Hall was 27 years old, ambitious, multilingual, and desperate to escape the confines of Baltimore high society. She dreamed of diplomatic service, of representing her country across the world's capitals. But in one terrible instant, as she climbed over a wire fence, everything changed. The shotgun discharged. The blast tore through her left foot with devastating force. What followed was worse than the initial injury. Gangrene set in, creeping through tissue like a death sentence. The doctors in Turkey did what they could, but modern medicine had its limits in 1933. The infection spread. There was only one option to save her life. They would have to take the leg. Not just the foot, not just below the ankle, but a significant portion below the knee. When Virginia Hall woke from the operation, she faced a new reality. She was now a woman with a prosthetic leg in an era that viewed such disabilities as disqualifying for almost any meaningful career. She named the prosthetic Cuthbert. It was wooden, uncomfortable, and required her to walk with a noticeable limp. But Virginia Hall refused to let it define her limitations. She applied again to the US Foreign Service, certain that her fluency in French, German, and Italian, combined with her education at Radcliffe and Barnard colleges, would overcome any prejudice. The rejection letter was crushing in its brevity and its cruelty. The State Department had an obscure rule barring amputees from diplomatic service. Secretary of State Cordell Hull himself responded to her appeal with patronising dismissiveness, suggesting she could become a fine clerk in the consular service instead. A lesser person might have accepted defeat. Virginia Hall was not a lesser person. If America wouldn't let her serve officially, she would find another way. She took clerk positions at US embassies in Warsaw and Izmir, biding her time, watching Europe slide toward catastrophe. And when that catastrophe finally erupted in 1939, when Germany invaded Poland and the continent plunged into war, Virginia Hall saw her opportunity. She volunteered to drive ambulances for the French army, putting herself directly in harm's way while her own government still considered her unsuitable for diplomatic work. Then France fell. In just 6 weeks during the spring of 1940, the supposedly invincible French military collapsed under the German blitzkrieg. The Third Reich occupied the northern regions directly while establishing a puppet government in the south, the Vichy regime that collaborated with Nazi Germany. Most Americans fled. Virginia Hall stayed. She made her way to London, furious, frustrated, and utterly determined to fight back against the Nazi occupation. At a cocktail party, while railing against Hitler to anyone who would listen, a stranger approached her. The man handed her a business card and asked a simple question. If you're really interested in fighting the Nazis, would you be willing to do something about it? That stranger represented Britain's Special Operations Executive, the SOE, Winston Churchill's secret army tasked with setting occupied Europe ablaze through sabotage, espionage, and guerrilla warfare. They were desperate for operatives who could blend into occupied territories, who spoke the languages fluently, who had first-hand knowledge of the terrain. Virginia Hall was perfect, except for one thing. No woman had ever served as a resident SOE agent in occupied territory. The organization's leadership hesitated. A woman, with a wooden leg, operating behind enemy lines, but Virginia Hall was unlike anyone they had ever encountered. She was fearless, resourceful, and possessed an almost supernatural ability to disappear into any environment. In August 1941, she crossed into Vichy France with forged papers identifying her as a journalist for the New York Post. Her cover was brilliant. It gave her a legitimate reason to travel, to ask questions, to meet with people across the region. Her code name was Germaine, though the French resistance would come to know her as Marie of Lyon. What Virginia Hall built in Lyon over the next 15 months would become the stuff of legend. The city was the beating heart of the French resistance, a crossroads where escaped prisoners of war, downed Allied pilots, and resistance fighters all converged in the shadows. Hall established what became known as the Heckler Network, one of the most successful intelligence operations of the entire war. She recruited dozens of agents, created safe houses throughout the city, organised escape routes that spirited Allied airmen back to England, and coordinated the delivery of weapons, money and supplies to resistance groups across southern France. Her apartment at 3 Place Olliers became a nerve centre for underground operations. She stored radio equipment, weapons, and thousands of francs in currency. She filed innocuous news stories about wartime rationing and daily life in Vichy France, but embedded within those stories were coded messages for her handlers in London. A potted geranium in her window signalled a message was ready for pickup. Messages hidden behind loose bricks in specific walls, notes stuck to the bottom of glasses at certain cafes. These were the tools of her trade. She organised the smuggling of tools concealed in sardine tins to imprisoned SOE agents, enabling a daring prison break from Malzac that freed 12 operatives. Virginia Hall became a ghost, always moving, always adapting, impossible to pin down. She developed multiple identities: Brigitte, Marie, Germaine, each persona carefully crafted for different audiences and different risks. One of her agents, Suzanne Bertillon, built a network of 90 spies across southern France who provided intelligence on German ammunition depots, fuel supplies, and submarine bases under construction. This information, transmitted through Virginia Hall's network, guided Allied bombing raids that devastated German military infrastructure. But success bred danger. The Gestapo knew someone was operating in Lyon, someone extraordinarily effective at disrupting their operations and humiliating their security apparatus. They began hunting for a woman who limped. In the occupied zones of Europe, where 25% of SOE agents would never return home, where capture meant torture and execution, Virginia Hall had become the most wanted Allied spy in France. The Gestapo gave her a nickname, La Dame qui boite, the lady who limps. They also called her Artemis, after the Greek goddess of the hunt. The irony was not lost on anyone. The hunters had become the hunted. The man leading the search was Klaus Barbie, chief of the Gestapo in Lyon. History would remember him as the Butcher of Lyon, a sadist personally responsible for torturing prisoners, sending 7,500 Jews and resistance fighters to concentration camps, and executing thousands more. Barbie became obsessed with capturing the limping lady. His agents flooded Vichy France. Wanted posters appeared throughout the region showing a sketch of a woman's face, details provided by French double agents. The Nazis believed she was Canadian. They were wrong about her nationality, but right about her importance. Barbie reportedly told his subordinates in a moment of rage, "I would give anything to get my hands on that limping Canadian witch." He never used such polite language. The actual quote was considerably more profane, but his determination was absolute. He mobilised 500 Gestapo agents into the region. French police, who had previously protected Virginia Hall, could no longer be trusted. In November 1942, when the Allies launched Operation Torch and invaded North Africa, Germany responded by occupying all of France, eliminating the distinction between the Vichy zone and the occupied zone. For Virginia Hall, this meant the Gestapo's full resources could now be brought to bear in Lyon. She fled without telling anyone, not even her closest contacts. Speed and secrecy were her only advantages. She took a train from Lyon to Perpignan, then hired a guide to lead her over the Pyrenees Mountains into neutral Spain. It was November. The mountains were covered in snow and ice. The trek would cover somewhere between 30 and 50 miles depending on the route, crossing peaks that reached 7,500 feet in elevation. For anyone, it would have been an ordeal. For a woman with a wooden prosthetic leg, it should have been impossible. Virginia Hall made the journey anyway. She walked for 2 days through snow and freezing temperatures, her prosthetic leg screaming with every step. The cold made the wooden leg even more uncomfortable. The straps chafed raw against her skin, and the uneven terrain threatened to send her tumbling with every awkward step. Before leaving, she had sent a message to SOE headquarters in London. "I hope Cuthbert doesn't give me too much trouble." The response from London, which didn't understand that Cuthbert was her prosthetic leg, was both tragic and darkly humorous. "If Cuthbert is giving you difficulty, have him eliminated." She made it cross. Barely. Spanish authorities immediately arrested her for crossing the border illegally. She spent weeks in a Spanish prison before the American embassy secured her release. She had escaped Klaus Barbie's grasp, but she was furious. Not relieved, not grateful to be alive, but absolutely enraged that she had been forced to abandon her network. She demanded to return to France immediately. The SOE refused. They told her what should have been obvious. She was compromised. Her face was known. Returning to France would be a death sentence. Virginia Hall listened to their concerns. and then did what she always did when told something was impossible. She found another way. If the British wouldn't send her back, perhaps the Americans would. She contacted the Office of Strategic Services, the OSS, America's newly formed intelligence agency that would eventually become the CIA. They hired her immediately, though at the insulting rank and pay of a second lieutenant, the lowest officer grade in the military. In March 1944, Virginia Hall returned to France. 3 months before D-Day, before the Allied invasion that would begin the liberation of Europe, she infiltrated back into the country that had nearly captured her. She couldn't parachute in because of her prosthetic leg. Instead, she crossed the English Channel on a British motor torpedo boat and came ashore by rubber dinghy on the coast of Brittany near a town called Roscoff. She arrived with a new code name, Diane, new forged identity papers claiming she was Marcel Montaigne, a rural peasant woman, and a new mission: organise and arm the French resistance to create absolute chaos behind German lines before the Allied invasion. Her transformation was remarkable and disturbing. At only 38 years old, Virginia Hall disguised herself as an elderly peasant woman in her 60s. She dyed her soft brown hair a dirty grey-black. She found a London dentist who filed down her white American teeth to resemble those of a rural French woman who had lived a hard life with poor nutrition. She wore heavy, shapeless skirts and oversized sweaters to add bulk to her frame. She shuffled her feet when she walked, turning her distinctive limp into the uncertain gait of an old woman. She knew that German soldiers and Gestapo agents were still hunting for the limping lady. Her disguise had to be perfect. She carried with her a battered suitcase that contained cutting-edge technology, a wireless radio that could transmit messages to London from anywhere in occupied France. This suitcase radio was one of the most dangerous pieces of equipment an agent could possess. German direction-finding trucks patrolled constantly, listening for radio transmissions. They could triangulate a signal's location within minutes. Every time Virginia Hall transmitted, she risked immediate detection and capture. She would have to broadcast her messages quickly, from constantly changing locations, always staying ahead of the German hunters. Virginia Hall moved through the French countryside like a phantom. She rode a bicycle from village to village, posing as a milkmaid. On at least one occasion, she sold cheese she had made to German soldiers who had no idea they were buying from the most wanted Allied spy in France. She tended herds of goats as cover, while observing German troop movements and military installations. She lived in barns, in attics, in the homes of brave French civilians who risked everything to shelter her. One of her safe houses was the garret of an 84-year-old man named Jules Jutry and his daughter-in-law Estelle. From their attic, she transmitted her radio messages while German patrols passed in the streets below. Her mission was to organise the Maquis, the scattered guerrilla bands of French resistance fighters who had been evading German labour conscription by hiding in the countryside. These were farmers, factory workers, students, people with no military training and almost no equipment. They were brave but disorganised, poorly armed, and fractured by competing political agendas. Virginia Hall needed to transform them into an effective fighting force in just a few months before the Allied invasion began. She scouted locations for parachute drops, marking fields and clearings where British aircraft could deliver weapons, ammunition, explosives, radio equipment, and money. She established contact with resistance leaders across multiple regions: the Cher, the Conne, the Nièvre, and eventually the Haute-Loire in the mountains of central France. She negotiated, cajoled, and occasionally bribed the self-proclaimed colonels who led various Maquis groups to accept her coordination and follow a unified strategy. It was not easy. As a woman holding only the rank of second lieutenant, she faced constant resistance from men who refused to take orders from someone they considered their inferior. Virginia Hall complained to OSS headquarters, "You send people out ostensibly to work with me and for me, but you do not give me the necessary authority." But she found leverage. She controlled the money. She controlled the weapons. In late July 1944, 3 aircraft dropped supplies directly to her forces, planeloads of rifles, submachine guns, grenades, explosives, and ammunition. The Maquis leaders, who had doubted her, suddenly became considerably more cooperative when they realised she could deliver what they desperately needed. The sabotage operations began in earnest. Under Virginia Hall's coordination, the resistance fighters launched a campaign of systematic destruction against German infrastructure. They cut railway lines, not once but repeatedly. 16 separate rail lines were severed, bringing German troop movements to a crawl and forcing lengthy detours. They derailed freight trains carrying supplies to the front lines. 8 separate derailments scattered German equipment across the French countryside. They destroyed bridges, 4 major railway bridges blown apart with explosives, forcing German engineers to waste precious time and resources on repairs, while Allied forces advanced from the beaches of Normandy. They cut every telephone line in their operational area, severing German communications and forcing commanders to rely on easily intercepted radio transmissions or time-consuming courier systems. They changed road signs and altered street names in towns, creating navigation chaos for German units trying to move reinforcements. They ambushed supply convoys, taking out trucks and capturing or destroying the vital materials German forces needed to resist the Allied advance. The statistics tell only part of the story. Virginia Hall's resistance forces are credited with neutralizing 150 German soldiers and capturing another 300 to 500 more. The exact number varies depending on the source, while suffering only 12 casualties themselves. But the true impact was psychological and strategic. German commanders never knew where the next attack would come from. They had to divert troops to guard railway lines, to escort supply convoys, to patrol communications infrastructure. Forces that should have been defending against the Allied invasion were instead scattered across the countryside hunting for shadows. Between July 14th and August 14th, 1944, as Allied forces broke out from the Normandy beachhead and swept across France, Virginia Hall transmitted 37 intelligence messages to London. She reported German troop movements, identified headquarters locations, and provided targeting information for Allied aircraft and artillery. She was the first Allied agent to report that the German General Staff had relocated its headquarters from Lyon to Le Puy in the Haute-Loire region, information that allowed Allied commanders to adjust their strategy accordingly. The Gestapo intensified their hunt. German direction-finding trucks prowled the countryside, hunting for her radio signal. Klaus Barbie, now desperate as German forces retreated across France, mobilized everything he could to find the limping lady who continued to torment his forces. But Virginia Hall had learned from her earlier escape. She never transmitted from the same location twice in a row. She constantly moved between safe houses, always staying ahead of the German hunters, always broadcasting just long enough to send her messages before disappearing again into the French countryside. In the Haute-Loire region, Virginia Hall organised and trained 3 full battalions of Maquis fighters, approximately 1,500 men in total. She coordinated their equipment, their training and their operations. When Operation Dragoon, the Allied invasion of southern France, began on August 15, 1944, her forces were ready. They forced German occupiers to withdraw from the town of Le Puy-en-Velay. They harassed retreating German columns, slowing their movement and inflicting casualties. They cleared entire departments of German soldiers before American forces even arrived. The irony was rich. A Jedburgh team, 3 military specialists sent by the Allies to train and supply the resistance battalions, finally parachuted in on August 25th. They arrived to find the work already done. Virginia Hall commented with characteristic dry humour. This was after the Germans had been liquidated in the department of the Haute-Loire and Le Puy liberated. The military specialists had arrived to organise an operation that a woman with a wooden leg had already completed. The transformation Virginia Hall orchestrated was staggering. She had taken scattered, disorganised resistance groups and forged them into an effective guerrilla army. She had disrupted German communications, destroyed their infrastructure, and prevented reinforcements from reaching the crucial battles in Normandy. Dwight Eisenhower himself would later estimate that the French resistance, which Virginia Hall had been instrumental in organising and supporting, shortened the war in Europe by approximately 6 to 9 months. 6 to 9 months of warfare, of bombing raids, of soldier and civilian casualties, prevented because people like Virginia Hall had made occupied France into a burning hellfire for German forces. By September 1944, Paris was liberated. The Third Reich's occupation of France was collapsing. Virginia Hall arrived in Paris on September 22nd, just weeks after the city's liberation. She was there among the celebrating crowds when General Charles de Gaulle led the victory parade down the Champs-Élysées. But she couldn't celebrate for long. She and another OSS operative, Lieutenant Paul Guyot, who would later become her husband, were already preparing for their next mission, infiltrating Austria to foment resistance against the last Nazi holdouts. In September 1945, after the war in Europe had ended, Virginia Hall received the Distinguished Service Cross from General William Wild Bill Donovan, the head of the OSS. It is the United States military's second highest decoration for valor, ranking just below the Medal of Honor. Virginia Hall was the only civilian woman to receive this award during World War II. President Truman wanted a public ceremony, wanted to celebrate her extraordinary heroism. Virginia Hall refused. She was still operational, still working in intelligence, still conducting missions that required anonymity. A public ceremony would compromise her ability to operate in the shadows. She continued serving in the CIA, the agency that succeeded the OSS, until her mandatory retirement in 1966 at age 60. She granted no interviews. She left no memoir. Even her family knew only fragments of what she had accomplished. She believed quite correctly that spies who talked too much ended up captured or worse. Many of her friends from the resistance had been betrayed because someone couldn't keep quiet. She would not make that mistake. Virginia Hall passed away in 1982 at age 76. For years, her story remained largely unknown outside intelligence circles. The CIA honoured her memory, eventually naming a training facility after her and creating exhibits about her operations. But it wasn't until the 21st century that her remarkable story began reaching wider audiences through books, documentaries, and historical research. Today, Virginia Hall stands as a symbol of determination overcoming prejudice, of courage defying impossible odds, of one person's refusal to accept the limitations others tried to impose. She was rejected by her own country's diplomatic service because of her gender and disability. She was hunted by the Gestapo, survived torture-ready interrogation had she been caught, crossed mountains on a wooden leg while evading capture, and returned to occupied France when every rational voice told her it was suicide. She organised resistance forces that helped liberate a nation and shorten one of history's most devastating wars. Klaus Barbie never caught her. The limping lady who tormented him across 2 years of occupation eluded his grasp completely. He would eventually face justice for his war crimes, convicted in 1987 and sentenced to life in prison, where he remained until cancer claimed him in 1991. But he never got his hands on Virginia Hall. She was too smart, too resourceful, too determined to let evil triumph. Her story reminds us that heroes don't always look like what we expect. They're not always the strongest or the fastest. Sometimes they're women told they're not good enough, people with disabilities dismissed as incapable, individuals who refuse to accept the world's limitations and instead change the world through sheer force of will. Virginia Hall changed history, one transmission, one sabotage operation, one trained resistance fighter at a time. She turned occupied France into a nightmare for Nazi forces and paved the way for liberation. If you found Virginia Hall's story as inspiring as we did, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe to Ignis Tempora for more incredible stories from history that need to be told. Drop a comment below with your thoughts and let us know what other historical figures we should cover. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.